Thank you all very much. Thank you, Elder Billy.
Thank you.
Let me share my screen with you, and then hopefully we can make some progress. Right? Are you seeing just one slide, or are you seeing more than
one slide?
You're just seeing the one slide. So I just want to make sure that what you haven't got is two slides on the screen. Can you see my next slide, or you can just see the one slide?
Only one slide, I can see. Perfect.
I think last week we had a bit of a challenge with two slides. That's really good. Excellent. Well, look, it's great to be back. Just some, I suppose, some housekeeping right at the very beginning. Look, and I've left a message in the comments in the chat section here on Zoom that you know, there will be a number of opportunities for you to ask questions or to make comments, and you can do that either by raising your hand. I think there's a little electronic hand you can raise, and I'll see that, or you can ask questions here in the chat section, and you can make comments in the chat section, and again, I'll do my best to introduce your question or to bring your point in. I'm very, very quickly just going to, for those of you that weren't here last week or want to have a quick recap on what we looked at last week, I'm just going to do a really quick recap on what we discussed last week. This is all about my passion for getting and inspiring and equipping Bible-believing followers of Jesus to go into public life, and hopefully something of what we learned last week, something of what we'll learn this week, we'll be able to use to encourage us, to inspire us to go and make a difference in politics, in government, in public life. But just a quick recap on where we're at. Well, sorry, this is what we're going to talk about this week. We're going to talk about developing a biblical worldview. What does the Bible have to say about politics? What are kingdom values in public life? Oh, I apologize. That's what we discussed last week. And we'll have a quick recap on that. This week, we're going to talk about faith and justice and leadership in public life, what that might look like. Now, last week when we met, you remember I spoke about the 7 mountains of human endeavor, the 7 areas where believers can get involved. All of humanity is basically broken down into one or a combination of any of these different mountains of global society. We have the business community, we have government, media, entertainment, education, family, and faith or religion. And the one that we're talking about today, the one we spoke about last week, is the mountain, this mountain of government and politics. And it's the one that, you know, I feel called to, and it's the one that I hope many others will feel called to as well. However, there is no getting away from the fact that if you are a Bible-believing follower of Jesus, you are called to either work on the mountain of government and politics, or you are called to pray for the mountain of government and politics. There is no third option. There's no escaping it. The scriptures are clear. You should either be on that mountain, climbing it, or working on it, or you should be praying for it, or both. But what we cannot do as believers is distance ourselves from government and politics. What we can't do is say it's not for us, it's for somebody else. That would be us avoiding our God-given responsibilities to govern. That's that mandate responsibility that God gave to Adam and Eve when he gave them the responsibility to look after the garden. That then follows on to us. We have a God-given responsibility to look after our planet, to look after each other, to look after our towns and our cities and our villages, and to govern, to rule, to have dominion, the scriptures say. So we have a responsibility and we cannot escape from it. Last week, I went through from Genesis to Revelation, all of the books in the Bible, all of the books of this amazing book, where politics and government is mentioned. And every single book of the Bible, there is a talk about either government or politics or justice, that you cannot escape, that the scriptures are filled with challenging stories and challenging scriptures about how we can get involved and how we should get involved and what it looks like when God's people get involved in government and politics. For those of you that were there last week, we also covered the Parliament of Owls. This was this little game where I said there were really 4 main types, but possibly 5 types of political animal. You have those who are low on integrity and low on intelligence. They're the baboons. They make a lot of noise, but they're not very smart. Then you've got the sheep. They're low on intelligence, but they've got reasonable amounts of integrity. Then you have the fox politician. They're pretty smart, but they're low on integrity. And then you've got the owl politician. They're the ones who are both highly intelligent, both academically intelligent, but also emotionally intelligent, and they have high levels of integrity. And what we want are more owl politicians. The job of the owl is to protect the sheep being a metaphor for the public, is to isolate the baboons. And unfortunately, we have to work with the foxes. The job of the baboon is to scare the sheep, but the baboons are manipulated by the foxes. You see, the foxes are very cunning. So the foxes manipulate the baboons make a lot of noise, they scare the sheep. The job of the owl is to protect the sheep, isolate the baboons, and work with the foxes. I also spoke about the 3 C's, the 3 things that we are looking for in our political leaders. They need to have charisma, i.e. they've got to be likable. They've got to be people that you think are, when they walk into a room, you recognize them. They cannot be invisible. They cannot be, people with no charisma. They need charisma. They've got to be competent. We all know what it's like when we have incompetent leaders. We need to have competent leaders, and they need to have good conduct. So that means that, both in their personal and professional lives, they are well behaved, and they are doing things with high levels of conduct. And we all know, we discussed it last week, that there are some politicians that are very, very high on charisma, maybe a little bit lower on competence or on conduct. Some will be very high on competence, but very low on charisma. And what we're really looking for in terms of strong biblical leaders, they need to have both a good balance of competence, charisma, and conduct. But above all, they also need to have a calling, because if they don't have that calling to go in and serve in public life, then that's not, they're acting disobediently. So we really need to have people who are called to do the job, that are competent, that have got charisma, and have got high levels of conduct. We also discussed last week this whole issue of partisan politics. Are political parties a good thing? And hopefully I argued that they were. You need to have a contested environment. You need to have this adversarial politics that we have, particularly in the West, where we argue and test and we contend for what we think is truth. But you need to be in a political party to make that happen. We talked about, can there be such a thing as a Christian political party? And my argument, and good people can disagree with me, but my argument is I don't think that's a brilliant idea. I think actually we as believers need to be salt and light in existing structures and go and make a difference there, and go and be Christians in, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats or the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or the Liberal Party, whatever it might be, to go into those parties and make a difference from the inside of those. And then we discussed, is there a better system of government than a democratic one? And hopefully I was able to articulate successfully that whilst the democratic systems that we tend to have in the West whilst none of them are perfect, democracy is still the least worst option. It gives people choice, it gives people freedoms that others have. And I think, and I can't remember who said it, I will find out, but it was somebody said that, you know, democracy is the worst way of governing apart from all of the others. So it's basically the least worst option. When we were talking about partisan politics last week, you know, I talked about the basically, you can be in the center, you can be center left, center right. I think as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, those three areas are pretty safe to be in. You know, they're moderate, they're not authoritarian. As soon as you get into hard left or hard right, or, you know, some of the more extreme ends of political thinking, they become, history teaches us, they become increasingly authoritarian, increasingly, you know, hard nationalistic. And that's something which I think as believers, we should be avoiding, and we should be encouraging others to avoid. Much, much better to be in the moderate center, center right, or center left. And I think, you know, and again, good people can disagree, but, you know, I think that's the safest place for believers to be. And then also last week, we spoke about some areas of global diplomacy, you know, some of these supranational organizations like the World Health Organization, NATO, and others. These are organizations which many people have got very strong feelings about. They're very anti what some of these organizations do and what some of them stand for. My argument is, well, it's fine. You know, we are free to disagree with them and free to be frustrated with some of the positions that they take. But what we cannot do is ignore them. It's important that, just as I spoke about being involved, believers being involved in public life in other ways, it's important that we are also engaged in this. So when I spoke about us being involved or praying, these are also organizations that we need to pray for or get involved in, or both. And then finally, last week, I don't know if any of you did this. Let me know if you did. I'd be really encouraged to hear what your thoughts are. But I left you with an assignment, and that was read the story of Nehemiah and perhaps write an essay on it. Write an essay on what you think kingdom values might look like where you live. And then also to watch the movie Amazing Grace. Download the film Amazing Grace and watch it, the story of William Wilberforce, the second greatest human that ever lived, in my opinion. And then also perhaps make contact with one of your local politicians, invite them for a coffee and ask them how you can pray for them. So that's, look, a really, really quick recap on where we were last week. Before I move forward, are there any questions or any comments anybody wants to make? I hope you like the mug, by the way.
Nice. You chose the word charisma over the word character. Maybe you just distinguish charisma and character?
Thank you. Okay, so when I'll go back to that slide there. This one. So when I talk about charisma, now, yes, character, we can talk about character, but character is very often very similar to conduct. So if somebody is good character, they will have good conduct. Charisma is more than just character. So charisma is, you know, it's the ability to, as I say, when you walk into a room, people know you're there. So I give you an example of a global politician with enormous levels of charisma, and that would be Boris Johnson. So that would be my prime minister, or Donald Trump is another one. They have, you know, unusual levels of charisma. I mean, Boris Johnson is like a rock star. You know, wherever he goes, people like him and they mob him like it's Beatlemania almost. He gave a very important speech yesterday here in the UK, and it's just oozing charisma in a way that very, very few global politicians have been able to muster. You know, when you look at someone like Donald Trump, when he walks into a room, or Bill Clinton is another example. Bill Clinton, when he walks into a room, you know, that he just has so much charisma about him that, you know, it's very, very attractive. He makes people feel like they're the most important person in the world when he meets them. We have a TV program in the UK called X Factor. I don't know if you have it where you are, but X Factor, that's what we're looking for. It's that special personality that some very unusual people have, where, you know, it's more than just character. Character is really important. Conduct is really important. You know, charisma is this larger than life personality. And whether we like it or not, modern politics, particularly modern democratic politics, is moving in that direction where personalities and charisma are becoming hugely important. And it's the fact that, you know, it's now about Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and, you know, social media and those kind of things. It's the things that Donald Trump harnessed so well for his election in 2016, that, you know, he was able to get across his personality in you know, very, very quickly, because it's just so high on charisma. Now, my argument is you need to have a good level of charisma, but you also need to have good conduct, and you also need to be competent, and obviously you need to be called. I hope that answers it, because I think character is quite similar to conduct in terms of, you know, being of good character or being of bad character. Charisma is more that special, like the special sauce that you get in a Big Mac. You know, it's hard to define.
Yeah, thanks.
Does that answer the question, Billy?
Yes, thanks. It's good.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So I'm going to talk about what are kingdom values, political leadership. What are kingdom values in public life? And last week we went through from Genesis to Revelation. We went through all of the, you know, all of the different books of the Bible with different stories. And when I talk about kingdom values, perhaps another way of putting it would be biblical values. I prefer to use the word kingdom values because it's the Bible plus our lived Christian experience. And, you know, there is the kingdom of heaven, and then there is the, that's the one that we're looking for. And so what are those kingdom values that we're looking for in public life and in our public leaders? Well, if we were face to face, I would be doing this with a big flip chart, and I'd have a pen, and I would be taking your notes, and I'd be writing them down, and we would be discussing, you know, what a characteristic is, and who in the Bible we can find, where we can find it. So, you know, one of the key kingdom values that we're looking for in public life is law abiding. We want our political leaders, we want our governments to be law abiding. And, you know, I mean, there are plenty of examples that you could look at in the scriptures for this, but Jeremiah was one. And honestly, we can say there are 10 other examples for law abiding leaders in the scriptures. Wisdom. We want our public officials, we want our politicians to be wise, and of course we've got Solomon, who we can look to for that. What happened when God granted Solomon whatever it was, you know, one wish, whatever you could have? He wanted wisdom so that he could govern effectively. It's a great prayer. Lord, give me wisdom. You know, we also want them to be good leaders. Everybody in this room, everybody on this call, we know what it is like to see a good leader or a bad leader or an average leader. One of the greatest leaders that you'll read about in the scriptures was Nehemiah. He was cupbearer to the king. And that's why I suggested last week that you you reread the book of Nehemiah and see what an amazing character Nehemiah was, who rebuilt the walls of the city, and really led effectively, actually introduced a form of welfare, a form of social security. And I think it's the first time we read about welfare being organized like that, actually by a city official, and Nehemiah was that. So we need our political leaders to be law-abiding, we need them to be wise, we need them to be good leaders, we need them to be moral. Again, there are plenty of moral characters in the scriptures. I quite like Job. One of the things, I have 4 children, and one of the things that I try and regularly do is pray for my children, just in case, interceding on their behalf in case they've done anything wrong. Job did that, and he was afflicted and cast down, and he remained completely moral in the way that he responded to the temptations and the challenges that he was faced, and he was rewarded with it. But we want our political leaders to be moral. We also want them to be generous. No one likes a stingy leader. No one likes a stingy individual. We want people to be generous, and that's not just financially generous, but generous of spirit. And a good example of that is Joseph. Again, a leader in the scriptures that rose to very high levels of political power and of influence, was remarkably generous. A very good example of generosity in the scriptures. We also want leaders that promote freedom and liberty. One of the 4, we have something in the UK called British values. We're promoting British values all the time. Those British values are liberty or freedom, democracy, justice, and tolerance. And so I think that's a really good value to be promoting, is the whole notion of freedom and liberty. No one wants to be in an authoritarian environment where we can't think for ourselves, where we're sort of shut down. Moses introduced, he promoted freedom and liberty. He took the slaves out of Egypt and tried to get them into the promised land. People that promote freedom and liberty, they are the kind of kingdom values that we want to support. Integrity and truthfulness. Joshua, he was Moses's chief of staff, and he was known as a man of tremendous integrity, and somebody who remained truthful. And by the way, all of these characters that we're talking about, all of them sinned at some point or another. So, and just like us, they were fallen. The only one who didn't sin, of course, was Jesus Christ. The rest of us are all, we also have our failings, including everybody on this page. But nevertheless, they had some overwhelmingly strong characteristics that I think are worth looking at. Titus. If you read the book of Titus, you'll see how he promoted fairness. We need to have political leaders that are fair, that promote justice and who are just. And James, the book of James, when you read that, you see how, what is just and what is justice really comes across in that. It's a terrific book. Again, I would recommend it. People who are caring and compassionate. We want our political leaders to be caring and compassionate. I think apart from Jesus, and tell me if I'm wrong, put it in the chat if you like, is there a more caring or more compassionate character in the Bible than Boaz, the kinsman redeemer? In the book of Ruth, you will read about Boaz, a great caring and compassionate leader who looked after to Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth, and really really took care of them in the most compassionate way. Interestingly, Boaz's mother, I'm sure you all know this, but Boaz's mother was Rahab the prostitute. And Rahab, the prostitute, actually finds herself in the genealogy of Christ. But Boaz was her son. and he demonstrated great compassion to these two alien women that were that had come into his farm and into his area that he was responsible for. We also want our political leaders to be democratic, and whilst the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about democracy, if you look at in the book of Numbers, where the concept of democracy and democratic process and representative leaders, you can see a whole section around Aaron, which is fascinating. Competent, as I said, with our 3 C's: competent, charisma, and conduct. King David was competent. I mean, he was an incredibly competent king, a competent leader, one to look at. Sacrificial. Well, Daniel, I would argue, obviously the most sacrificial leader we had was Jesus, but Daniel was pretty sacrificial. You look at what he gave up, and he even was prepared to go to die for his beliefs. And good, you know, he was spared, obviously, but a sacrificial leader. We also want our leaders to be good educators. We want them to be able to take people with them, not just to say, this is what we're doing, whether you like it or not, but to help take people on a journey. And the Apostle Paul was a great educator, as we know, but also a great biblical leader. One of my all-time political heroes is Ronald Reagan. He was a terrific educator. Whenever you look at videos of Ronald Reagan when he was talking, whether it was on defense or tax or, you know, some other economic virtue that he was, or economic policy that he was trying to promote, he really took people with him. He took time to explain to the public and educate the public as to why it was necessary to do what he was doing. And as I say, a really good example, I think, of what it is to be an educator in public life. And finally, we want our political leaders, kingdom values that we're looking for. We want people to be visionary. And obviously a good example of a visionary leader is Isaiah, but there are many, many others. So when we're, as I said earlier, if we were doing this face-to-face, this would be much more interactive than it is. But this would be pretty much how it would end up. There may be a sort of a broader discussion about it, but kingdom values in public life and biblical characters are intertwined. And if we are men and women that want to be promoting and being part of kingdom values in public life, these are the kind of values that we find in the scriptures and we find from our biblical heroes as well. So I'm going to talk about, moving on, about faith and justice and leadership in public life and what that might look like. So faith and justice. There are 4 areas that we're going to discuss, and this is where, you know, I want you to be involved a bit. You know, perhaps put your hand up or comment or ask a question in these 4 areas, because this is where, when we go into public life, when we're serving in the political area, these are just 4 areas that I wanted to touch on, where we're going to be stretched, where we're going to find ourselves challenged, particularly if we are followers of Jesus. Now, there will be many others, but these 4 are 4 which are very big at the moment and have been for the last few years. One is this whole issue of how do we disagree well, particularly if you look at both Western Europe and the United States, where our politics has become very, very polarized. You know, you have people that set a position here and another group that set a position here, and there's no coming together. There seems to be no generosity. There's no kindness shown between these 2 groups. How do we as believers disagree well? We're going to we're going to explore that. The other issue is life issues. This is the issue of pro-life, pro-choice, death penalty, things like stem cell, things like this, you know, where there are profound concerns and objections by many legislators as to what we should and what we shouldn't do. The whole issue of how far should science go, and how is that encroaching on life as we know it. So that's an important area for us to have a kingdom perspective on. The third one is race, and that's something, and race and ethnicity really. It's particularly in countries like the UK and the US, Canada, France, where we don't have a monoculture, you know, where we have got you know, tremendous levels of, and I personally think encouraging levels of diversity. But what comes out of that are these issues of race and the tensions that surround race. So you will all have seen the Black Lives Matter protests that started in the United States and have now come to Europe and other parts of the world. How do we, as kingdom-minded men and women, how do we handle that issue? And then finally, but there are others that we could look at, is the issue of poverty. How do we, as followers of Jesus that are interested in public life, how do we tackle this issue of poverty and inequality that is coming up? So first of all, and again, please leave comments in the chat or questions in the chat, and I'll be able to pick those up as well, but feel free to come in. But the issue of disagreeing well, as Christians in public life, we need to model what loving relationships across different sociological, political, and even denominational divides might throw up. And disagreeing well, as I say in the slide here, disagreeing well offers us an opportunity to model the grace, the love, and the mercy of God in difficult circumstances. Jesus said that it was by the love that we had for one another that men would know we are his disciples. And we need to demonstrate that even when we disagree. So, you know, I know that there are people of different political persuasions who, just like me, are followers of Jesus. And we may disagree on economic policy. We might disagree on perhaps a military aspect or military policy. We might disagree on how to solve some of the big challenging problems, whether it is some of the ones that we're going to come on to, like, you know, race or poverty or inequality. How we demonstrate that we can disagree well will demonstrate to those people that are watching us what it is like to be a follower of Jesus in these difficult circumstances. You know, it doesn't serve the kingdom well when we get into a public argument over some of these matters where we are demonstrating that we are not necessarily carrying the love of Jesus in the way that we respond, particularly if we respond harshly to our critics, if we are ungenerous in the way that we treat other people. There is a man we have in British politics. I know some of you have come across him on the television or on YouTube. His name's Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's the leader of the House of Commons. So he's like one of the most senior members of the government. He's a very, very gentle man. He's a gentleman, but he carries himself with enormous care and enormous graciousness. He's also, you know, a very, very strong believer, and he recognizes that when people, if they ever saw him lose his temper or behave in an ungracious way, he's conscious that, you know, that he's not just letting himself down, but he's letting down the the man he follows. And so with Jacob Rees-Mogg, he carries himself with this enormous graciousness with the way that he treats his critics and those that would attack him. And look him up on YouTube, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You'll see what I mean. He's tremendously good at this whole issue of disagreeing well. So disagreeing well because of the increased polarization. So what I'm talking about this, as more and more of us are being pushed out into taking political extremes. We don't take political extremes, but the media and others, they like to be able to push you into extremes. Public discourse is becoming increasingly disrespectful, increasingly ungracious, and where your motives and your background will become, questioned, and people will dismiss or demonize us. And it's sometimes easy for us to fall into that trap and to do that. And as I say in the slide here, this is very clearly not a Christian approach to public life. This is not how we should be doing it. I think when we get involved in that kind of politics, it's cheap political point scoring. I think it diminishes our Christian witness. And I think that we need to develop a strategy or develop skills that help us to be firm and secure in our position without being like that. So we can respect somebody without necessarily agreeing to them. I noticed somebody, Billy said, we agree to disagree agreeably. Oh, WADA, I like that. We should put that on our t-shirts. We agree to disagree agreeably. Or another way of putting it, we can disagree without being disagreeable. But respecting somebody without agreeing with them, I think, is a really important skill that we will find. So if any of you ever find yourself working in local government or national government, or even in the workplace where you find yourself, you will find that there will be people that you are forced to work with that you will disagree with. And I think there are plenty of opportunities where we can collaborate. I use this word co-belligerence. Co-belligerence is where you will find you'll have the same agenda, you will have the same ambition, but you might disagree on plenty of other things. You might disagree on almost everything else, but if there's an area that you agree on, you might find yourself working with that individual or those individuals, because it's important for you to achieve the project or the goal that you're working on. I think collaboration and co-belligerence are important skills for Christian public leaders to develop. How do we even work with people who may have no faith or a different faith to ours, who may have completely different convictions to ours, but we work with them to achieve a common goal? I think those are really important skills. So we can be highly respectful without necessarily agreeing with everything that they believe, but we can find ourselves where there is common ground. We can find ourselves working with them. It's also important that we choose our battles. We don't necessarily jump on every battle. Now, what I mean by this is, let's say, for example, there is an issue that is coming up that you think, I know that if I insert myself into this political battle, I'm going to get distracted from what I feel my calling is. And you may not feel that, well, that's not my battle. That's for somebody else to fight. I've got to, even though I agree with them, I cannot support it because tactically, I've got to be focused on where I'm headed. Winston Churchill, and I'm sure you all know who Winston Churchill is. Winston Churchill said in a famous quote, he said, if you stop and throw stones at every dog that barks, you'll never reach your destination. He said, if you stop and throw stones at every dog that barks, you will never reach your destination. That's quite a clever way of saying, choose your battles. You know, not every battle that is going on in public life is for you to fight. And it's worth remembering that some battles, you've got to be prepared. You know, you've got to be prepared that will be potentially a career-ending battle for you, you know. And if that's not the one that you're called to, if that's not the problem that you feel called to solve, you could end up being diverted into that, and then you will never solve the one that the Lord has wanted you to be involved in. So I say in this, you know, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity. What I mean by that is where something is absolutely essential, then we unify with everybody. Where something is not essential, then you allow grace, liberty. You know, people should be free to vote however they want. But in everything, we should be demonstrating charity. And there's a good book that I think you can read by Os Guinness. Now, I know some of you are familiar with Os, and I think he's even spoken in Singapore at least once. He wrote a book called The Case for Civility. It's a really, really good book, and one that I could recommend and would encourage you to buy and to read up on. Okay, so before I move into the next section, in terms of disagreeing well, are there any comments or any questions? I see we have Elder Wee with us. Everyone's unusually quiet today. Is something going on that I don't know about?
Elder Wee, please unmute.
Yes, Colin, we are listening well.
Okay. Well, look, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand and I'll tackle them. Okay, so the next section we've just discussed, disagreeing well. We're now going to talk about the next section, which is life issues. Now, life issues are those really complicated issues of things like abortion, things like stem cell research, things like the death penalty, all of those kind of things. And there will be Christians that have different opinions on this matter. So as I said as I say on the slide, you know, as Christians in public life, we need to model loving relationships, you know, across the sociological, political, denominational divides. This is a really important part of handling these really sensitive and very difficult subjects. Issues regarding the end of life become very highly charged. So if you look at in the US in particular, even today in Texas, there is a big court case going on about abortion laws in Texas. These are global issues, and some countries are much more relaxed than others. But it's more than just abortion. As I say, it's things like the death penalty, it's IVF, it's assisted suicide. Here in Europe, we have a very large push for allowing people to have assisted suicide. So if they get to the end of their life, if they feel that they have a very poor quality of life, then they want to take their own lives. That, you know, some countries are now allowing it to happen. So in Switzerland, you can go to it's called a clinic, a dignitas, it's called, and they will end your life for you. I think in the Netherlands, in Holland, I think there are similar facilities, and there are politicians who are pushing very, very hard for these facilities, these centres to be opened up in the UK, in Ireland, in France, in America, where people can be, they can have assisted suicide or euthanasia. But these are very live issues that politicians are grappling with. And these are important issues for us to not necessarily avoid, because, and we may take different opinions on it. We may have different views to each other. But this, again, is an area of faith and justice that we have to be aware of, and we have to prayerfully work through and not leave to other people. I don't know how much of an issue this is in Singapore, for example, all of these different issues, but life issues are they're a very big issue constantly here in the UK and in the US. So understanding what those issues are is the first thing. Really important that we don't ignore it. We have to understand it. We have to read up on it. We have to educate ourselves as to what some of the challenges and the issues are. But we also have to empathize with people who hold different views. It's not just sympathize. I think it's really important that we try and understand why some people might have such strongly held views that may be different to our own. And this is more than just politics now. This is, I think, in life in general. How do we empathize with people who hold those different views? So, for example, this year, in the last, about 6 months ago, my father died. My father lived with us in my house. And as he was getting towards the end of his life and he was very, very sick, I could see that for him, he wanted to die. He was ready to die. Now, there are many people who live in that state. Now, fortunately for him, it was only a matter of weeks at the point where he just said, that's it, I'm finished. I want to die. It was only a matter of weeks before he actually died. There are some people that live in that state for decades, for a very, very long period of time. And whilst I'm not necessarily agreeing with the idea that we should allow people, we should have euthanasia, we should allow assisted suicide, I don't agree with that. But I think it's helpful to try and understand what they're going through, so we can not just sympathize, but we can find empathy and use our emotional intelligence to try and understand why it is that they feel the way that they do and why people might argue for it. It just helps us when we're framing our own arguments to be able to not come across as being too hardline, too dogmatic, but we are people who are generous. We understand perhaps a bit more where they're coming from. And you never know, for some of us, it might soften our approach if we take those lines. But I think showing empathy, I think, is something that's really important. But again, I accept that these are highly charged, highly emotive and contested subjects. We also need to, if we believe in a cause, if, for example, we think that we would like to see fewer abortions across the world, if we think that life is important and that we don't have the right, that humans don't have the right to take another life, and if we feel very strongly about, for example, the issue of abortion, then it's important that we develop tactics and a strategy for working together so that we can see the number of abortions become far less, either in our country or across the world. What we can't do is just kind of belligerently say, this is what I believe, and not think carefully or tactically how we achieve it, and working together, and sometimes working with people that we might disagree with. And I'll give you an example on that. There may be that you take the position that all abortions are wrong all the time. And let's imagine that you are now in the process of having a vote where you can, in the UK, I think it's 24 weeks. You can abort a child up to 24 weeks. Now, there are some people that if a vote came along that said, let's reduce it to 20 weeks, they still wouldn't vote for that, because they would say, I'm not voting for abortion. I have to dogmatically vote against it. Even though it was a reduction, they might feel so strongly that they don't want to be seen to vote for something which allowed abortion, even if it was up to 20 weeks. And I think this is where we've got to be tactically smart, and we've got to be strategically aware, and why it's important that we work with others that we might disagree with on some of these subjects. So we have to be, we have to be really thoughtful about how we're approaching this. So as I say, sometimes it's appropriate to be silent, and then sometimes it's appropriate to speak out. On this issue of life issues, particularly around abortion, I think, in my opinion, and I may be wrong, but in my opinion, some people speak out when they should be silent. And actually what they end up doing is harming the overall cause. Maybe unwittingly they do this, but they harm the overall cause of seeing fewer abortions because they are unwise in how they speak out when they perhaps should be silent. A really good book that I recommend is called Issues Facing Christians Today by John Stott. It may well be now a newer version available. This is the picture I put on the screen is the 4th edition. But John Stott really covers these issues, really sensitively and really carefully. And I can, as I say, I can recommend that book for further reading. Okay, before we move on, is there any points or questions on this subject, or any points of clarification that anyone needs or would like?
Excuse me, I just want to ask a question regarding suicide or assisted death. Over here in Australia, we've got a lot of strategy to help in abortion. But with respect to assisted death, are there churches, can you organize churches to spend time with these people who are on the verge of dying, to pray for them, minister to them, and help them to die faster, earlier?
I don't know. I don't know about the situation in Australia. I can tell you that in the UK, what's called the end of life care was set up. The original end of life care discipline, if you like, was set up by a Christian, as somebody called Dame Cicely Saunders.
Yeah.
And this was about 120 years ago.
Yeah, yes.
Where the whole concept of end of life care from a Christian perspective was really sort of brought into well, how do we help people die well? We want people to live well when it comes to, and by the way, we're all going to face this at some point. How do we help people to die well? And I think and it's a really unpleasant thing to talk about, because no one wants to talk about this. But I think it's important that we have proper legislation to allow people to die well. And I don't think that we've got that legislation right in many countries. I don't know about Australia, but it's certainly an area where, as believers, you should be really involved in, because, you know, it happens to everybody. I don't know what the, you know, I don't know what your churches are doing in Australia about it, but this has always been an area where Christians have been involved.
I've not heard of any good thing in Australia, but I was just wondering, I don't know how to get politicians to spearhead these. You know, I've heard of Cecilia Saunders, but this concept end of life care is so brilliant, but not really implemented. Can you help us?
Well, no, I mean, I can only say that from a political perspective, this is not going to be a vote winner or a vote loser one way or the other. Talking about death does not endear people to vote for you. It needs to be the sort of thing that happens when you're, you know, as a parliamentarian, or involved in, it's all of the stuff that happens sort of quietly behind the scenes. Those and making sure that we've got proper legislation that respects the dignity of how people die, I think is something which is really important. And certainly, I don't know about Australia, but in the UK, this whole issue of assisted dying and euthanasia, it comes up very, very regularly. And my fear is that particularly in the UK, we don't have enough men and women who have in politics who have thought the issue through and have formulated and articulated their own mind about it, their own thoughts about it, so that they're able to make sure that, you know, legislation that they might disapprove of, that they don't want to see happen, doesn't just come in by, you know, by stealth, but equally they're able to frame legislation which is going to be, you know, the most appropriate and the most kind, the most generous, the most godly way of handling it. So I think it's the sort of thing that I would say, identify who your local parliamentarians are in Australia. I mean, I'm guessing this will be at federal level rather than even at state level. I'm pretty certain it would be a federal issue. So perhaps even go to Canberra and identify some parliamentarians who you think might be sensitive to this issue and help them formulate their own ideas. It's a big job. I mean, look, this is the kind of subject that people will devote their entire career to make sure that your country's legislation is, you know, is protected and is as decent as it can be. But you know, I can't speak about the specifics of Australia, but certainly I know that it's an enormous subject which people don't like talking about.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate the ideas that you shared.
Any other questions or comments on this issue of life?
Okay, presuming that the person, you know, the quality of life is so bad, there are different types of medical treatment. So, like for instance, the life support machine, right? If the person's quality of life is very bad, and the family decide, the doctors may recommend to a life support machine or no life support machine, but that would make a difference, right? The treatment itself would determine whether he can prolong longer, maybe by weeks, or he will die earlier. Would that be an ethical issue, Dr. Ong?
Sorry. This is this is a very complicated thing.
Yeah, I know.
Because people have got different strategy to prepare them. But I think basically the idea is they just try to somehow prolong the person from dying. But I think, as the speaker said, no one has really worked out something to help people die graciously or appropriately, or when they need to die so that they can die nicely. I think the church can specialize in this. I think this is something that the church has that no other people have, to help people to die graciously.
I agree with you. And I think that the church does have a very, and Christians have a very special role in ensuring that these kingdom values that I'm talking about, this is the very reason why I'm talking about this, is because it's exactly these issues that we need to make sure Christians are influencing, so that we can see what those kingdom values are being played out for people when they are at their most vulnerable. And my concern is that unless we have kingdom-minded, intelligent men and women going into public life and serving, then you will find that the most vulnerable, the most the people who are at the most difficult time of their lives will not get the right care or the right justice or the right support that they need, because we were too busy doing other things. And I think that's exactly why I'm passionate about inspiring and equipping believers to go into public life. It's for these very important issues that we're talking about.
I really feel that this is a field where the gospel is most will be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I hope so. Look, I'm going to move on. Unless there's any other sort of pressing issues, I'm going to move on because I'm conscious of the time. But thank you very much for those contributions. So we've looked at these life issues. We've looked at disagreeing. We're now going to look at race. And again, for those of you that are in countries which have a really pluralistic, different communities, and there's a lot of diversity, you will see, particularly the US, the UK, and other countries like that, race has become possibly the biggest issue that is facing us. We're having regular protests and marches, and it is affecting how companies have to behave. It's affecting, and I'm not saying this is in a bad way, but it's certainly having an impact on things like, board composition of businesses. It's having an impact on the media everywhere. Race is now becoming, and is perhaps rightly, one of those really, really big issues that is dominating our cultural landscape, our business landscape, our academic landscape, and our political landscape. When Paul wrote, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, you are all one in Christ Jesus," he asserts that a Christian's identity is found primarily not in our ethnicity, not in our social status or our gender, but it is in the man that we follow. It is in Jesus. However, what we've seen, and evidence would suggest, is that Christians have allowed themselves to be divided by race, by culture, by social status. And if you look at our churches around the world, we often have, don't we, a white church or a black church or an Asian church, or the church for the professionals and the church for the poor. It's and all of this has become, I think, a big stain on the church in general. It's a really, if you look at it from a global perspective, if you take a step back and you see how fragmented the church has become, where it has become you know, where we have these different churches for different groups, where denominationalism has become more important than Jesus himself. You know, almost our religion is more important than our faith, if that makes sense. You know, I often in the report that I'm writing for the government in the UK, I come up with some really important definitions of what is religion, what is faith, and what is belief. And perhaps the best way I can put this is that, you know, faith is a subset of belief. You need to have a belief to have a faith, but you don't need to have a faith to have a belief, if that makes sense. So a belief can be environmentalism or veganism, or but belief can also be a religious belief or a faith belief, like being a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. Religion very much is now about the organization of that faith. So our, you know, what is religious behavior? And it's interesting. I don't say this in my report, but I'll say this to you, that, you know, if you look at the scriptures, religion is not really spoken about very often in the scriptures in a good way. Often when Jesus is talking about the religious, he's talking about, you know, those Pharisees who follow a religious dogma, who follow their religious code. In James, the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27, the writer says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress and keep yourself from being polluted by the world. That's the kind of religion that we're talking about, you know, to care for orphans and widows in their distress, not the kind of now the point about what I'm trying to say is that for those of us that have a living faith, the kind of faith that the Apostle Paul is writing about, you know, it doesn't matter whether we're black or white, male or female, from the north or from the south, you know, it is not primarily about anything to do with who we are or our outward appearance. It is all about our identity in Jesus. However, the challenge that we face, as I say here, too often we've allowed ourselves to be conscripted. The church has been conscripted. It's been involved and engaged in supporting of racism and this term ethnocentrism, you know, where we kind of say a Christian looks like a certain type of person and will and is being used by the state or used by the religious bodies to achieve something. You know, I think this is still an issue in 2020, 2021. I think it's still an issue today. And I think it's something that we as followers of Jesus have to be really careful about. And I think really keen to, you know, to embrace a different way of approaching it. Now, I say here that there is a range of views on how Christians should respond to issues of racial injustice. Now, some Christians will argue that it is a waste of precious resources, that we should focus only on evangelism. And other Christians would argue that this is an issue of the utmost priority. It's something that we, you know, that we have to be putting right. You know, we have to be we have to be seen as agents of change to bring about greater justice here on earth. And I mention here in the slide that sometimes Christians have been both unwitting and deliberate partners in racial segregation. For example, apartheid in South Africa, the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. They're two notable examples of where Christians have been involved in this kind of segregation, this kind of horrible behavior. So we need to find a Christian leader those of us on this call now, we need to find ways to develop empathy so that we can find a way forward, because this problem, you know, is not going away. So we need to empathize with those that hold different views on how this is important. As I say, there will be some people that say we shouldn't be involved in this because we should only be involved in evangelism, and there'll be others that say no, we need to bring about justice here on earth. And they might have, and you know, you might find yourself at one end of that argument or the other. Talk about tactics for working together for the common good. So how do we use, I'll ask this question actually, you know, how can Christians use the influence and the power that we have to speak up for others in an attempt to see the common good? So what I mean by that is, you know, how can we create an environment where we are allowing this debate, this big issue of race and ethnicity that is in front of us, to that debate to be handled well? You know, when I talk about disagreeing without being disagreeable, I think this is an area that Christians can't withdraw from. I think we have to be central to it. But does anyone want to sort of comment on this issue of race? I see Ban Lee is back, which is nice.
Pastor Bandi. In the countries in this region, like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, to multi-religious race, like the M race is very much more also the religion. It's a bit hard sometimes to draw the line how, in the exercise of tolerance and harmony, should a Christian leader, a minister, participate in some of those activities like visiting mosques or temples and things like that? Yeah. Mm.
So I you know, I know that, and as you know, I've been to Singapore and you know, to the Far East a number of times, and I appreciate that, you know, it's not as ethnically diverse, but as you say, it is religiously very diverse, and that sort of sense of tribalism that exists, you know, between different groups, and I think that it becomes really challenging when you have one group that asserts itself as being kind of nationalistically superior to another. So if you have a country, for example, that says, well, we are, you know, we're an Islamic country, and therefore Muslims are going to have all of the top jobs, even though there may be a number of Christians or a number of Hindus or a number of Sikhs or Buddhists that are living in that country. How do we encourage pluralism in that kind of environment? And I mentioned this last week, but it does remind me of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, they were a minority in a country which was not of their faith, and they had to change so much about the way that they lived. Their names changed, their culture changed, what they wore changed. You know, they had to change their clothing. Everything about them was assimilated into the culture of the land that they were in, and yet they remained true to their God. They didn't, you know, they didn't compromise on their own personal faithfulness, but they were in a very hostile environment, an alien culture, and yet they found ways of prospering, and not only prospering, of leading in this alien culture, you know, this foreign culture that they found themselves in. And I think very often that as Christians, we will find ourselves in environments which are alien to us, that will feel hostile to us. And sometimes we need to know when to defy and when to comply, when to assimilate, and how to be careful about how we integrate into that community so that we can have influence and so that we can be the men and women that God wants us to be. The challenge will be, Elder Billy, I think, the challenge will be other Christians. It will be them that say to us, you've compromised, you've sold out, you've become just like them. Why can't you be more like Daniel? And then we go, but we are being just like Daniel, who was fully assimilated, and even, as I say, had his name changed and changed his clothing and everything, but always remained true to his God. And I think it's an important lesson of how do we handle ourselves in those kind of environments. One of my mentors is a guy called Jonathan Aitken. Jonathan Aitken was a minister here in the UK. He famously went to prison for committing a crime, and then when he went to prison, he became a believer, and then he started a very strong prison ministry. And about 20 years ago, I think it was, I was with him, we were having a cup of tea, and he said to me, remember this, he said, ultimately, it doesn't matter what other people think. We only have an audience of one. And, that audience of one is the thing that will get us through. If we will often find that it will be other believers who will try and bring us down. It will be other believers that try and discourage us from making a difference, particularly in an alien culture. And I think that that lesson from my old mentor is so true. There's an audience of one. There's only one that matters, and that's God himself. So I think this whole sensitive subject of race, different religions, how do we work with them? I think that we have to find tactics for making an influence, particularly if we're in a minority. But that also means that when we're in the majority, we have to be generous to those others as well. We can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, I can't expect that, for example, in Indonesia, let's say, I would like to see, Christians given, equal rights, equal access, no discrimination to anyone and I just pick Indonesia as a random example, to be involved in Indonesia in the most incredible way. Christians should be free to do that. If we in this country, in the UK, are not prepared to offer the same generosity to people of, different faiths, even though Christianity is the majority religion here, I think, we've got to be consistent and generous about that. I don't know why I picked on Indonesia. I could have picked on any country. We've just got to be generous. But
in Indonesia, they're Pancasila, faith in one God, but all the religions are treated fairly,
That's good.
In Indonesia,
I'm glad you put me right on that.
In Malaysia, the church is given room to move.
Yeah,
they're given the liberty. For instance, they can buy the retail shop space to have the church, but legally, actually, they cannot. But they don't implement it. They don't discriminate. Because where else can they meet? Where else can they buy land to build? So they buy shop lots which are meant for retail or light industrial or whatever. But the church is allowed to meet there. So while they prefer the Muslim religion and their preferences are subsidy and so on, the minorities sometimes have to work with recognizing there are certain disadvantages and not insist on their rights. If I'm a migrant, let's say to another country, it would be wrong for me to try to make my rights, even if I become a citizen. I must understand that I'm a migrant. I'm coming over. I just got to be more innovative, just got to be more enterprising if I'm going to succeed. Otherwise, actually, I'm encroaching into somebody else's space, you know.
Yeah.
And I cannot make it more difficult for other people. So that is being reasonable. That's being empathetic and operate within practical reasons. But for instance, if the Muslims come to London and their communities say, "Hey, we want to introduce Sharia law," you're coming to Britain, you're introduce Sharia law. I think the British should not allow for that. The Australian government put it very clear. This is Australia. You don't like it, you don't have to come here.
I think there are. I think there are examples where I think we can be generous and we should be accommodating, but not where it infringes upon our 4 fundamental values of, as I said earlier, liberty, democracy, justice, and tolerance. Where if for example somebody comes in and says, "I demand," and a good example might be the issue of polygamy. You know, in some countries, in some religions, they're allowed to have a man is allowed to have more than one wife. In the UK, and I think it's probably the same in Singapore, you're not allowed to have multiple wives. You only have one wife. You can only marry one person. That's the law. Now, if somebody comes to the UK and says, "Well, my culture is we're allowed to have more than one wife," well, tough. You know, I agree with you. We have to be. That's not who we are. That's not our values. But if, for example, somebody has, a religious objection to paying interest, and it's interest on a loan, but there is possible to find a creative financial product, a financial instrument which is sensitive to their religious needs, which doesn't harm anybody if that's introduced. I have no problem in seeing, well, let's introduce that financial product, if it's okay. As long as it's fair and no one is harmed, that would be something to me that is a generous and sensible way to accommodate other people's faith beliefs. And every major faith community will have, issues. The Jewish community has certain things that we allow and we respect and we support. Same with Sikhs. Give you an example. In the UK, you have to have a crash helmet when you ride a motorbike. You have to have a helmet. But if you're a Sikh, because they have their turbans, they are exempt. There is a religious accommodation for them. They don't have to wear a crash helmet. And that seems to me to be a very generous and sensible way that we can accommodate that. So perhaps that's some of what I'm talking about, more generosity.
Perhaps the turban gives some cushion.
Sorry, Pastor Wee.
But the turban gives some cushion, but it's not the helmet now. Not as good as a helmet.
I'm going to move on before you get yourself into trouble.
Okay.
Okay, so the next subject is poverty. Another, I said that there was just some big issues of faith and justice. Well, poverty. Well, we all have different ways of how we want to address this issue of poverty. I said in James chapter 1, verse 27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep yourself from being polluted by the world. Caring for the vulnerable is an essential part of discipleship. Matthew 25, when Jesus said, "When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was naked, you clothed me." The concern for the poor and the marginalized is a very normal part of what it is to be a follower of Jesus, because Jesus commanded us to do this, to look after those who are the most marginalized and the poorest. So how do we as Christian leaders in politics, for example, how do we create, how do we set the example on this issue? And there will be different ways, you know, some Christians will say here is a solution, and others will have a different solution. But we both agree that alleviating poverty is something that you know is central to who we are as followers of Jesus. So understanding the wider biblical perspective on poverty, I think, is important. And I write, due to a dualistic understanding of salvation, many Christians understand that the gospel is to be a form of spiritual escape from this world, and that this is not the gospel that Jesus taught or demonstrated. So some people say that we are all about just helping, preparing people for the next life. Just get people into heaven. That's our only job. And I argue that is not what Jesus taught or what Jesus demonstrated. Poverty and injustice are part of the fall of humanity, and the church and believers and followers of Jesus have a vital response in making sure that we are addressing those issues here on earth. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be preparing people for eternity, that we shouldn't be evangelizing. It's not one or the other. We have to do both. We have to make sure that we have society which is just for everybody, and caring for people is a vital part of our worship, I would say. You know, look at what did Jesus teach us in that commandment, to love God and love our neighbor. And he doesn't say our neighbor has to be just Christians, it's everybody around us. And loving our neighbor means that we've got a moral and a faithful responsibility to tackle the issue of poverty. So first of all, we need to understand what the wider biblical perspective on poverty is. We need to empathize with those that hold a different view to us. Again, I use this word empathy as well. There will be people that say the way you solve poverty is to tax the rich and to give the money to the poor. And there'll be others that say, no, we need to give skills and training to the poor so that they're able to make their own money so they won't be poor anymore. And maybe there's all sorts of different views in between. But there will be believers that hold a different view to you and will hold it very, very strongly, and we have to empathize with them. And the issue of poverty alleviation is very complicated, but we need strong Bible-believing followers of Jesus in the middle of the argument, who is passing and framing legislation so that we can see the poor are getting justice. Now, I say here, some Christians see justice as a distraction from gospel ministry. And some people say that, you know, we shouldn't be worried about, you know, evangelism when we've got immediate problems here. There will be these opposing groups. We need to bring these groups together. And I think we need to understand where those groups are coming from and work with them, find an empathy for both arguments. But nevertheless, we need to address it. And look, when it comes to poverty, it's not just poverty of money. I think that we have a job as believers to tackle things like a poverty of ambition, or a poverty of hope, or a poverty of opportunity. A poverty of opportunity will very often mean if somebody doesn't have the opportunities that perhaps you and I might have, that will mean that they're never going to have the opportunity to perhaps, you know, become economically prosperous. They might not have the opportunity to start and raise a family. They might not have the opportunity to move out of the environment that they're in. So poverty of opportunity, poverty of hope, poverty of money, you know, poverty of self-esteem, all of these things I think we have to help tackle. I don't think poverty is just about finances, although it is it is a big one. And we as Christians, I think, need to make sure that we're helping tackle this issue of poverty through legislation and what we're doing. And again, a really good book I can recommend about the whole subject of global poverty is Engaging Globalization by Brian Myers. It says, Engaging Globalization, the Poor, Global Mission, and Our Hyper-Connected World. I found it a very fascinating book, and I can recommend. So I'm getting a bit of feedback there. Someone needs to turn their microphone off. Any questions? I'm near the end. I've been going for an hour and 40 minutes, but any questions on anything I've said there before I move on? Okay, very good. So I've spoken about leadership in public life. What might it look like? I've told you that as believers, we are either called to work on the mountain of government and politics or pray for the mountain of government and politics. There is no third option. So, you know, I've given us a taste of some of the bigger challenges that we will be having to face. And again, like last week, I really want to encourage people to get involved. Yes, you have to pray for it. Of course, that's not an option. You have to pray for government. You have to pray for politics. But one way that you can be involved at hyper-local level, how can you get involved at hyper-local level? Well, that could be something as small as creating a small community where you live, you know, just your road. Like when I was growing up, on the road that I lived in, my next door neighbor, she used to organize street parties, and she was a real organizer, you know. And so I remember once the road got closed off, no cars were allowed in and out, and everybody came out, and they had a sort of a street party just to celebrate something. I can't remember what it was. But that brought together us just a small community of the people where we lived, just on our road. And those are the kind of things. For example, if you wanted more policemen in your area, or better streetlights, or if the issue of rubbish collection in your streets wasn't, you know, good enough, or any issue that was important to you, you can organize yourself at a hyper-local level. That's just you and your immediate neighbors, you know, just you and your street maybe, and do some community organizing to bring about a change, bring about difference. And as believers, because we're good at turning up to things, because we're good at going to church, we're good at organizing, you might find yourself suddenly being just in your street, or just in the block where you live, just in the community that you find yourself in, you might find yourself actually doing things which are quite political, quite influential, to bring about change where you are, just with the people who are immediately around you. So community organizing, small communities, or if you're in some parts of the world, you have something called a parish councillor, where it's not like a member of parliament, but it is, again, it's hyper-local. So that's one thing that it could look like. I would encourage all of you to be involved in something which was hyper-local. After that, something that was local. You know, you could be involved in your town or your city, either as an elected councillor, a mayor, a magistrate. In the UK, we have magistrates. They don't have to be legally trained, but they have to make judgments. They have to be people who can make good judgments. And they sit in a magistrate's court, and they are guided by the law, by lawyers, but it's an important local role. Or even a school board. I bet you, wherever you live, there will be a local school that has a school board, and that school board is made up very often of local people and parents and teachers. and that controls how that school is governed. So you can be involved at local level in any of these areas. And I can tell you that there aren't enough Bible-believing followers of Jesus involved in being an elected councillor, being a mayor, being a magistrate, or on our school board. So there is plenty of opportunities for believers to get involved. So that's at hyper-local level, at local level. Now at national level, I really hope that someone on this call might think to themselves, I want to become a member of parliament. I'm going to run for public office, be an MP, or be a senator, or be a congressman, become a civil servant, work for the government body, become a judge. If you're a lawyer, become a judge, become a high court judge. They have enormous influence. Or become a government advisor, or sit on national boards, whatever it might be. But there are national opportunities for you to be involved. And then there are international levels, becoming a diplomat or a high commissioner or a special envoy, where at international level you will have influence. And then finally at supranational, it goes back to these groups that I spoke about, where you've got these really important, very large organizations that have tremendous influence across the world. We need to see more Bible-believing followers of Jesus saying, I'm going to go and work for the UNHCR or the World Bank or the World Trade Organization or any of them. So these are some areas, both hyperlocal, national, international, and supranational, where believers need to be involved. And if you're not going to be involved, then at least pray for those organizations and for people that are believers that are in there. So that's the end. It's now just open to any questions. I've got a few minutes that I can answer any questions or elaborate on any points. Does anyone want to say anything? I've got to the end of my talk now. Elder Billy, you look like you're about to say something.
No,
Britain doing after Brexit? It seems to be doing better in Europe.
Sorry, Chairman Wee, what did you say? Something about Brexit?
Okay, how is Britain doing better after Brexit?
Well, that's a really good
United
question.
Kingdom.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, I personally think, this is my personal view, Brexit was good for the United Kingdom. I think being independent of the European Union, identifying ourselves as a sovereign nation. I said this last week, we're still the 5th biggest economy in the world. We're the 6th largest manufacturer in the world. We're a very, very important and influential nation that brings with it lots of responsibilities, but being hitched to the European Union, and good people can disagree with me, but being hitched to the European Union, I think was, it brought many benefits, but I think that we are better off being independent of it. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, guess what? Our economy is doing okay. We've had the terrible global issue of COVID-19. So all of our competitor economies, if you like, or our peer group, we're all suffering because of COVID-19. But our economy is growing. Our employment rates are up, and I think so. Yeah, I think it's been okay. It's not going to be without its problems, of course. For anybody that has had a very messy divorce, you will know that it comes at a cost. But for us, this is a messy divorce. It will come at a cost. But I think in the medium and long term, it will be better for us. But also, I think it would be better for Europe. That they recognise that they need to. Continental Europe probably does need to work together more. We are doing just fine, and we've got a prime minister that You know, he made Brexit happen, and he happens to be the Prime Minister now as well. So, you know, we're in pretty good shape.
Good, thank you. Any question, Pastor Bunley?
In terms of military defense, how does the UK rank worldwide?
Militarily, well, look, we're
Militarily.
still. Did you say militarily?
Yes.
Yeah. So look, we still are one of the most you know, powerful military forces in the world. We have a tremendous navy. We have a wonderful air force, and our army and our special forces are still recognized as being amongst the best in the world. But no country can do anything by itself. We always have to work in partnership with our allies, and our allies, both obviously the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and our European allies as well. So we carry a very heavy burden, really, in terms of that. We have a responsibility to ensure that across the rest of the world that you know, where we can act, we do. But we would never, very rarely do we do anything unilaterally. It's always done bilaterally or in with the support of others, or with supporting others, other countries. But you know, we're very generous. We're ahead of our NATO commitment of our defence spending, and of course our defence and aerospace sector in the UK, in terms of our contractors, Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, and others. You know, we are world class. I mean, there's the UK, the US, Israel are, in terms of Western allies, have, and France as well, incidentally, we have amongst the most incredible technological and advanced you know, military capability in what we produce in our aircraft, in our warships, and our and other things. So yeah, I mean, look, again, I would say, you know, I think we're in pretty good shape. I personally would like to see other countries, particularly our NATO allies, you know, raise their level of spending and their commitment. But I think the US and the UK are doing their, you know, are doing their fair share.
No more questions? Maybe I just ask one. Maybe you can share something to emphasize the importance of praying for the government and to encourage us to pray for government.
Definitely. I mean, as I said, you know, there is no third option. If you're a Bible-believing follower of Jesus, you have to be either involved in politics, praying for politics, or both. You know, it's so important that we are praying not only for our government, but also for our oppositions, both nationally and internationally. You know, we have to be asking for God's help. I believe that, you know, God is very interested in how the world is run and how governments work. And I believe that, you know, that I believe in the power of prayer. I believe that prayer is an important part of who we are as faithful followers of Jesus. And therefore, why would we not be praying for these really big, important issues like government? You know, we will often be praying for the economy. We'll often be praying for the poor. We'll often be praying for world peace. We should be praying for our own governments and for our political leaders, whether they know Jesus or not, whether they are followers of Jesus or not, whether they have any other religion or no religion. We need to be praying for them, that they will have wisdom, that they will act justly, that they will follow mercy. And wherever we are, that should be a universal prayer. And as I said, you know, one of my things that I left you with last week was, you know, invite your local politician for a cup of coffee, or go and have a cup of coffee with them, a cup of tea, and ask them how you can pray for them. You know, it's so unusual that would happen that they will never forget it. if you were to go and so Elder Billy, if you were to telephone your local member of parliament and have a cup of coffee with them and say, I'm a born again, Bible believing, spirit led, devil kicking follower of Jesus, how can I pray for you? They will never forget that conversation, you know? And if they refuse to answer, just say, I'm just going to pray that you have wisdom, like King Solomon.
Good. Okay.
Look, I'm very conscious of the time. I think we're probably done now. It's nearly 3 o'clock in the afternoon here, and I have another Zoom meeting that I've got to get on in 4 minutes. So I'm sorry I have to disappear.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't know whether Alvi, you want to close in prayer. Alvi, are you still there?
Father, we thank you for
Thank you.
Father, we thank you for the time Colin spent to give us education on the importance of Christian and politics. And Lord, we thank you for the input and for the wisdom that has been given. We pray that you continue to bless his ministry with the Prime Minister of Britain and with the United Kingdom. Prosper and bless him and put him in a position of influence, we pray. And we thank you for all those who come, that we will have a political view, that we will continue to pray for the political leaders in our country. We give thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.